All right, everyone. This little video probably won't be too long, but we're going to be discussing a bit about how some compound if statements and stuff work. I've already created a little project here. But we're just going to do a couple of little if statements, compound ifs, talk about Booleans in general, and a couple of shortcuts you can use for some of the things. So normally when you write an if statement, you would say if, something, right? I'm going to make a nice little Boolean here. Let's see if I can remember if that's supposed to be capital or not in C++. I think it's lowercase. Bool, there we go. I have like 3 different languages I'm teaching here, and it's written differently in like every single one of them. So let's go with bool, and then I'll just say check1 equals true. So this is true. If I were just to print it, just so we can see, check1, that should print off the words true. We'll move you out of my way there, move this back on the screen so we can see. There we go. So I'm going to run, do a little check, and just so you know, it says 1. Well, 1 is true and 0 would be false in this case. So if I change this to false, I should get a 0. Different languages kind of treat them a little bit differently. C++ essentially treats them as a 0 and a 1 for true and false. So back in the olden days, the days of yore, you would get essentially on and off. So 1 would be like the light switch is on, and 0 would be the light switch is off. They had essentially switches and things like that that would turn on and turn off. And the concept is still kind of used today. Now, I know this works now, so let's check. I'll change it back to true. Now, we've talked about if some number equals another number, right? If 4 equals 4, that's going to be true. This whole statement becomes true. If this is true, the if statement works. Now, if I were to write if check1 equals true, and I just, print off it's true, that should print, correct? I'm sure everybody would probably agree, right? So we run it. I should say it's true. It works. Now, if I change this to false, obviously it's not true anymore. This fails. Now, I can write this out, and that's perfectly acceptable. But because this is all going to be true or false at the end of the day anyway, you can actually avoid writing that little extra. And I can just say if check1. And I will still get the same result, essentially. It's true. Well, what if I wanted it to be false? What if I wanted to say if check1 is equal to false? Well, I could, again, write it out this way, and that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, some people would probably kind of prefer that. That way you can kind of, it's pretty easy to read. Now, if I wanted this to be false, I could say, if it equals false, I could say if it does not equal true, and I would get the same result. And I could alternatively just come over here and say not check. The exclamation point is not. So I run this, I still get it's true. Well, that's what I wrote. I'm dragging stuff up. There we go. Where'd my stuff go? There we go. We're back. All right, so it's true. All right, enter. So that works, right? So this is just a little shortcut you can use if these happen to be Booleans. Now, let's say I have multiple of these. I have a Boolean check1. I have a bool check2. So I have a couple of things I have to check. You can kind of imagine this in a game where 2 particular things have to happen in order for an event to occur. Maybe you have to be a certain level, and you also need to be, I don't know, have a certain item or something like that. Maybe when you're talking to somebody, if you sided with them during some argument earlier and you also like gave them money or did something else, then you get this particular dialogue or this particular outcome. And that's what these little booleans would be used for, those little checks, those little switches to make sure that those particular things happen, or flags would also be the term there. So I can say if check1 equals true and check2 equals true. If both of those equal true, I can run, and that should be true because they're both true. Now what if I said or? And or would be, again, this. It's usually right underneath the backspace key. It may look like a straight vertical line or two dots, depending on your keyboard. Well, this says if one of those is true. So as long as one of those is true, it's going to say true. Like if I made the first one false, this would still run. Because guess what? Well, that one's true. So it's still going to say it's true. And of course, I don't have to have the equals equals here. I can say if check1 and or check2. If I want them both to be true, I can just say and in the middle for that. Now, at this point, this would fail. It wouldn't work because one of those would fail. An and means both have to be true. An or means either has to be true. A lot of people get these two confused. They'll go in and they'll do an or here. So if I were to do, or check1, or check2, or check3, as long as one of those is true, it would still run. So this is the kind of thing you don't want to do if, like, I have an answer in each of these little slots and only one of them is the correct answer that I want. So I wouldn't want to do if this answer is this, if the answer they type in is this, if the answer is they type in this and put ors in between. Because if I do ors, then any of those answers could be considered correct. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful with that, depending on what you're doing. And there we go. And of course, I can do else if and do as many of these as I want. If I come in here and I do another or, and I have another Boolean maybe, or even doesn't have to be a Boolean. They don't all have to be the same. I can just make an int number equals 0 or something. And I can just say or number equals 0. Now, in this case, what happens? Well, if those are true, both of them, then this will run. If any of those are false, it'll check, well, is number 0? Okay, yeah, then it'll run. Now, what if I say and? Then in this case, all three of these have to be true. In this case, check1 has to be true, check2 has to be true, and number has to be 0. So we can kind of mix and match these if we need to. They don't all have to be ints or all have to be booleans. Some can be strings or other things depending on what you're doing. You can say, well, if they type in this name, for example, like password checkers, and the password is this, then they got them correct. So there's a couple of different ways you can kind of approach this. But I just wanted to let you know that there are a couple of little shortcuts here for when you're typing things in. A couple of the problems with the and the or that you could run into, and that sort of thing. Because going forward, you can do it like this if you want, or you can, of course, just write it out if that just feels easier to read for you. A lot of people, particularly early in programming, would prefer to write those out. You also have to consider if you're working with other people, it might just be better for everybody involved for you to do it kind of a longer path. As we go through programming, like if you go through a second level programming class, you will potentially have programs that can be every bit of 500 or 800 lines of code, depending on the teacher and the project. But that's not to say that the program has to be that long. If you know shortcuts and you're fairly well acquainted with coding, you could literally turn that like 800 line program into something that's like 100 or 200. And yet it would still do the same thing. The problem is you would do a lot more advanced techniques using loops and some other stuff, maybe some arrays or lists or something. And you can compress some of that code down so it's not as redundant. Of course, if everybody around you doesn't understand how that stuff works, you might just be, making more work for everybody else. So sometimes it's not good to be smarter than everybody else in the room. Other times it is. It just depends on what you're doing. If you're working with a huge group of people, it, you know, they may understand this a lot better than just that. Of course, everybody should understand that, hopefully by the end of programming classes, but, some people just, they do it one way and that's the only way they know. So again, you have to kind of consider who you're working with and what you're doing. If you're doing it on your own, you do it however you want. If you're doing it for a company or with another group, you may have to change how you label things and how you name things and stuff like that. Just depends on where you are. Well, anyway, that is just a quick rundown of some basic kind of compound ifs, how you can kind of use some of these little things to shorten your code a little bit if you needed to. It's not 100% necessary, but you can do it. So if you have any questions or comments or anything like that, please let me know.